Greetings from San Francisco on Bloomsday. I'm Esther Mulligan, and I'm being joined by Una Kavanagh, Bruce Spearman, Melanie O'Reilly, John Ilian, and Renee Gibbons. Did Bloom accept the invitation to dinner, given then by the son and afterwards seconded by the father? Very gratefully, with grateful appreciation, with sincere appreciative gratitude, in appreciatively grateful sincerity of regret, he declined. Did their conversation on the subject of these reminiscences reveal a third connecting link between them? Mrs. Reardon, a widow of independent means, had resided in the house of Stephen's parents from 1st of September 1888 to 29th of December 1891, and had also resided during the years 1892, 1893 and 1894 in the City Arms Hotel owned by Elizabeth O'Dowd of 54 Precious Street, where during parts of the years 1893 and 1894 she had been a constant informant of Bloom, who resided also in the same hotel, being at that time a clerk in the employment of Joseph Cuff of 5 Smithfield for the superintendence of sales in the adjacent Dublin cattle market on the North Circular Road. Had he performed any special corporal work of mercy for her? He had sometimes propelled her on warm summer evenings, an infirm widow of independent, if limited means, in her convalescent bath chair, with slow revolutions of its wheels as far as the corner of the North Circular Road, opposite Mr. Gavin Lowe's place of business, where she had remained for a certain time, scanning through his one-lens binocular field glasses unrecognizable citizens on tram cars, roadster bicycles, equipped with inflated pneumatic tires, hackney carriages, tandems, private and hired landaus, dog carts, pony traps and brakes, passing from the city to the Phoenix Park and vice versa. Why could he then support that his vigil with a greater equanimity? Because in middle youth he had often sat observing through a rondel of boss glass of a multicoloured pane the spectacle offered with continual changes of the thoroughfare without. Pedestrians, quadrupeds, velocipedes, vehicles, passing slowly, quickly, evenly, round and round and round the rim of a round, precipitous globe. What distinct different memories had each of her now 8 years deceased? The older, her bezique cards and counters, her Skye Terrier, her supposititious wealth, her lapses of responsiveness and incipient cathedral deafness. The younger, her lamp of colza oil before the statue of the Immaculate Conception, her green and maroon brushes for Charles Stuart Parnell and for Michael Davitt, her tissue papers. Were there no means still remaining to him to achieve the rejuvenation which these reminiscences divulged to a younger companion rendered the more desirable? The indoor exercises, formerly intermittently practiced, subsequently abandoned, prescribed in Eugen Sandoz Physical Strength and How to Obtain It, which, designed particularly for commercial men engaged in sedentary occupations, were to be made with mental concentration in front of a mirror so as to bring him into play the various families of muscles and produce successfully a pleasant rigidity, a pleasant relaxation, and the most pleasant representation of juvenile agility. Had any special agility been his in earlier youth? Though ring weight lifting had been beyond his strength, and the full circle gyration beyond his courage, yet as a high school scholar he had excelled in his stable and protracted execution of the half-lever movement on the parallel bars in consequence of his abnormally developed abdominal muscles. Did either openly allude to their racial difference? Neither. What, reduced to their simplest reciprocal form, were Bloom's thoughts about Stephen's thoughts about Bloom, and about Stephen's thoughts about Bloom's thoughts about Stephen. He thought that he was a Jew, whereas he knew that he knew that he knew that he was not. What the enclosures of reticence removed were their respective parentages. Bloom, only born male, transubstantial heir of Rudolf Virag, subsequently Rudolf Bloom, of Jean Bartoli, Vienna, Budapest, Milan, London and Dublin, and of Ellen Higgins, second daughter of Julius Higgins, born Callery, and Fanny Higgins, born Hegarty. Stephen, eldest surviving male, consubstantial heir of Simon Dedalus of Cork and Dublin, and of Mary, daughter of Richard and Christina Goulding, born Grier. Had Bloom and Stephen been baptized, and where and by whom? Cleric or layman? Bloom 3 times. By the Reverend Mr. Gilmer Johnston, M.A., alone in the Protestant Church of St. Nicholas Without, whom? By James O'Connor, Philip Gilligan and James Fitzpatrick together under a pump in the village of Swords, and by the Reverend Malone, C.C., in the Church of the Three Patrons, Rathgar. Stephen once by the Reverend Charles C. Malone, C.C., alone in the Church of the Three Patrons, Rathgar. Did they find their educational career similar? Substituting Stephen for Bloom, Stoom would have passed successively through a dame's school and the high school. Substituting Bloom for Stephen, Beliefin would have passed successfully through the preparatory junior, middle and senior grades of the intermediate and through the matriculation, first arts, second arts and arts degree courses of the Royal University. Why did Bloom refrain from stating that he had frequented the University of Life? Because of his fluctuating incertitude as to whether this observation had or had not been already made by him to Stephen or by Stephen to him. What 2 temperaments did they individually represent? The scientific, the artistic. What proofs did Bloom adduce to prove that his tendency was towards applied rather than towards pure science? Certain possible inventions of which he had cogitated when reclining in a state of supine repletion to aid digestion, stimulated by his appreciation of the importance of inventions now common but once revolutionary, for example, the aeronautic parachute, the reflecting telescope, the spiral corkscrew, the safety pin, the mineral water siphon, the canal lock with winch and sluice, the suction pump. Were these inventions principally intended for an improved scheme of kindergarten? Yes, rendering obsolete pop guns, elastic air bladders, games of hazard, catapults. They comprised astronomical kaleidoscopes exhibiting the 12 constellations of the zodiac from Aries to Pisces, miniature mechanical orreries, arithmetical gelatine lozenges, geometrical to correspond with zoological biscuits, globe map playing balls, historically costumed dolls. What also stimulated him in his cogitations? The financial success achieved by Ephraim Marx and Charles A. James, the former by his 1-penny bazaar at 42 George's Street South, the latter at his 6.5-penny shop and World's Fancy Fair and Waxworks, exhibition at 30 Henry Street, admission 2d, children a penny, and the infinite possibilities hitherto unexploited of the modern art of advertisement, if condensed in trilateral money ideal symbols, vertically of maximum visibility, divined, horizontally of maximum legibility, deciphered, and of magnetizing efficacy to arrest involuntary attention, to interest, to convince, to decide. Such as K2 Kino's 11 shillings trousers. House of Keys, Alexander J. Keys. Such as not. Look at this long candle. Calculate when it burns out and you receive gratis 1 pair of our special non-compo boots, guaranteed 1 candle power. Address, Barclay and Cook, 18 Talbot Street. Baclakill, insect powder. Very best, boot blacking. Unwanted, combined pocket two-blade penknife with corkscrew, nail file, and pipe cleaner. Such as never. What is home without plum trees potted meat? Incomplete. With it, an abode of bliss. Manufactured by George Plumtree, 23 Merchants Quay, Dublin, put up in 4-ounce pots and inserted by Councillor Joseph P. Nanetti, MP, Rotunda Ward, 19 Hardwick Street, under the obituary notices and anniversaries of deceases. The name on the label is Plumtree. A plum tree in a meat pot, registered trademark. Beware of imitations. Peat Mott, Trumplee, Monpat, Plumtrue.
Which example did he adduce to induce Stephen to deduce that originality, though producing its own reward, does not invariably conduce to success? His own ideated and rejected project of an illuminated show cart, drawn by a beast of burden, in which 2 smartly dressed girls were to be seated engaged in writing. What suggested scene was then constructed by Stephen? Solitary hotel in Mountain Pass. Autumn. Twilight. Firelit. In dark corner, young man seated. Young woman enters. Restless. Solitary. She sits. She goes to the window. She stands. She sits. Twilight. She thinks. On solitary hotel paper, she writes. She thinks. She writes. She sighs. Wheels and hoofs. She hurries out. He comes from his dark corner. He seizes solitary paper. He holds it towards fire. Twilight. He reads. Solitary. What? In sloping upright and back hands. Queen's Hotel. Queen's Hotel. What suggested scene was then reconstructed by Bloom? The Queen's Hotel, Ennis, County Clare, where Rudolph Bloom, Rudolph Virag, died on the evening of the 27th of June, 1886, at some hour unstated, in consequence of an overdose of monkshood, aconite, self-administered in the form of a neuralgic liniment, composed of 2 parts of aconite liniment to 1 of chloroform liniment, purchased by him at 10:20 on the morning of the 27th of June, 1886, at the Medical Hall of Francis Dennehy, 17 Church Street, Ennis, after having, though not in consequence of having, purchased at 3:15 on the afternoon of the 27th of June, 1886, a new boater straw hat, extra smart, after having, though not in consequence of having, purchased at the hour in the place aforesaid, the toxin aforesaid, at the general drapery store of James Cullen, 4 Main Street, Ennis. Did he attribute his homonymity to information or coincidence or intuition? Coincidence. Did he depict the scene verbally for his guest to see? He preferred himself to see another's face and listen to another's word, by which potential narration was realized and kinetic temperament relieved. Did he see only a second coincidence in the second scene narrated to him, described by the narrator, a Pisgah site of Palestine, or the parable of the plums? It, with the preceding scene and with others unnarrated, but existent by implication, to which add essays on various subjects, or moral apothegms. Example, my favourite hero, or procrastination is the thief of time. Composed during school years, seemed to him to contain in itself, and in conjunction with the personal equation, certain possibilities of financial, social, personal, and sexual success, whether specially collected and selected as model pedagogy themes of cent% merit, for the use of preparatory and junior grade students, or contributed in printed form, following the precedent of Philip Beaufoy or Dr. Dick or Heblin's Studies in Blue, to a publication of certified circulation and solvency, or employed verbally as intellectual stimulation for sympathetic auditors, tacitly appreciative of successful narrative and confidently augurative of successful achievement. During the increasingly longer nights gradually following the summer solstice, on the day but 3 following, videlicet Tuesday, 21st of June, S. Aloysius Gonzaga. Sunrise, 3:33 a.m. Sunset, 8:29 p.m. Which domestic problem as much as, if not more than, any other frequently engaged his mind? What to do with our wives? What had been his hypothetical singular solutions? Parlour games, dominoes, halma, tiddlywinks, spelinkens, cup and ball, nap, spoil 5, physique, 25, beggar my neighbour, draughts, chess or backgammon. Embroidery, darning or knitting for the police-aided clothing society. Musical duets, mandolin and guitar, piano and flute, guitar and piano. Legal scrivenery or envelope addressing. Bi-weekly visits to variety entertainments. Commercial activity as pleasantly commanding and pleasingly obeyed mistress proprietress in a cool dairy shop or warm cigar divan. The clandestine satisfaction of erotic irritation in masculine brothels, state-inspected and medically controlled. Social visits at regular, infrequent, prevented intervals and with regular, frequent, preventative superintendence, to and from female acquaintances of recognized respectability in the vicinity. Courses of evening instruction specially designed to render liberal instruction agreeable. What instances of deficient mental development in his wife inclined him in favour of the last mentioned, 9th solution? In disoccupied moments she had more than once covered a sheet of paper with signs and hieroglyphics which she stated were Greek and Irish and Hebrew characters. She had interrogated constantly at varying intervals as to the correct method of writing the capital initial of the name of a city in Canada, Quebec. She understood little of political complications internal or balance of power external. In calculating the addenda of bills, she frequently had recourse to digital aid. After completion of laconic epistolary compositions, she abandoned the implement of calligraphy in the encaustic pigment exposed to the corrosive action of copperas, green vitriol, and nut gall. Unusual polysyllables of foreign origin she interpreted phonetically, or by false analogy, or by both. Metempsychosis, met him pike hoses. Alias, a mendacious person mentioned in sacred scripture. What compensated in the false balance of her intelligence for these and such deficiencies of judgment regarding persons, places, and things? The false apparent parallelism of all perpendicular arms of all balances proved true by construction. The counterbalance of her proficiency of judgment regarding one person proved true by experiment. How had he attempted to remedy this state of comparative ignorance? Variously. By leaving in a conspicuous place a certain book open at a certain page, by assuming in her, while alluding explanatorily, latent knowledge, by open ridicule in her presence of some absent other's ignorant lapse. With what success had he attempted direct instruction? She followed not all, a part of the whole, gave attention with interest, comprehended with surprise, with care repeated, with greater difficulty remembered, forgot with ease, with misgiving re-remembered, re-repeated with error. What system had proved more effective? Indirect suggestion implicating self-interest. Example. She disliked umbrella with rain. He liked woman with umbrella. She disliked new hat with rain. He liked woman with new hat. He bought new hat with rain. She carried umbrella with new hat. Accepting the analogy implied in his guest's parable, which examples of post-exilic eminence did he adduce? 3 seekers of the pure truth, Moses of Egypt, Moses Maimonides, author of More Nabucco, Guide of the Perplexed, and Moses Mendelssohn, of such eminence that from Moses of Egypt to Moses Mendelssohn there arose none like Moses Maimonides.
What statement was made under correction by Bloom concerning a fourth seeker of truth, by name Aristotle, mentioned with permission by Stephen, that the seeker mentioned had been a pupil of a rabbinical philosopher, name uncertain. Were other unapocryphal illustrious sons of the law and children of a selected or rejected race mentioned? Felix Bartholdi Mendelssohn, composer, Baruch Spinoza, philosopher, Mendoza, pugilist, Ferdinand Lassalle, reformer, duelist. What fragments of verse from the ancient Hebrew and ancient Irish languages were cited with modulations of voice and translation of texts by guest to host and by host to guest? By Stephen, Shul, Shul, Shularun, Shul go Sinker Arug, Shul go Kyun. Walk, walk, walk your way, walk in safety, walk with care. By Bloom, Kafilach Harimon, Rachtech Maba'ad, Letzmartech, thy temple amid thy hair is as a slice of pomegranate. How was a glyphic comparison of the phonic symbols of both languages made in substantiation of the oral comparison? On the penultimate blank page of a book entitled Of Inferior Literary Style, Sweets of Sin, produced by Bloom, and so manipulated that its front cover came in contact with the surface of the table. With a pencil supplied by Stephen, Stephen wrote the Irish characters for G, E, D, M, simple and modified, and Bloom, in turn, wrote the Hebrew characters Gimel, Aleph, Dalet, and in the absence of Mem, a substituted Gof, explaining their arithmetical values as ordinal and cardinal numbers, videlicet 3, 1, 4, and 100. Was the knowledge possessed by both of each of these languages, the extinct and the revived, theoretical or practical? Theoretical, being confined to certain grammatical rules of accidence and syntax, and practically excluding vocabulary. What points of contact existed between these languages and between the peoples who spoke them? The presence of guttural sounds, diacritic aspirations, epenthetic and servile letters in both languages. Their antiquity both having taught on the plain of Shinar 242 years after the deluge in the seminary instituted by Phineas Farsai, descendant of Noah, progenitor of Israel and descendant of Habar and Harimon, progenitors of Ireland. Their archaeological, genealogical, and hagiographical, exegetical, homiletic, toponomastic, historical, and religious literature, comprising the works of rabbis and Chaldees, Torah, Talmud, Mishnah, and Gemara, Masor, Pentateuch, Book of the Dunkau, Book of Barimot, Garland, and Hoth, Book of Kells, their dispersal, persecution, survival, and revival in the isolation of their synagogical and ecclesiastical rites and ghetto, St. Mary's Abbey and Mass House, Adam and Eve's Tavern. The proscription of their national costumes in penal laws and Jewish dress acts. The restoration in Hannah David of Sion and the possibility of Irish political autonomy or devolution. What anthem did Bloom chant, partially in anticipation of that multiple, ethnical, irreducible consummation? Kolod balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homiya. Why was the chant arrested at the conclusion of this first distich? In consequence of defective mnemotechnic. How did the chanter compensate for this deficiency? By a paraphrastic version of the general text. In what common study did their mutual reflections merge? The increasing simplification traceable from the Egyptian hieroglyphs to the Greek and Roman alphabets, and the anticipation of modern stenography and telegraphic code in cuneiform inscriptions Semitic, and the Kinke Costate Ophram writing Celtic. Did the guest comply with his host's request? Doubly, by appending his signature in Irish and Roman characters. What was Stephen's auditive sensation? He heard in a profound, ancient, male, unfamiliar melody the accumulation of the past. What was Bloom's visual sensation? He saw in a quick young male familiar form the predestination of a future. What were Stephen's and Bloom's quasi-simultaneous volitional quasi-sensations of concealed identities? Visually, Stephen's, the traditional figure of hypostasis depicted by Johannes Damascenus, Lentulus Romanus, and Epiphanius Monachus as Leo Kendermic, says que Pedalion with wine-dark hair. Auditively, Bloom's, the traditional accent of the ecstasy of catastrophe. What future careers had been possible for Bloom in the past, and with what exemplars? In the Church, Roman, Anglican, or Nonconformist, exemplars the very Reverend John Conmee S.J., the Reverend T. Solomon D.D., Provost of Trinity College, Dr. Alexander J. Dowie, at the bar, English or Irish, exemplars Seymour Bush, K.C., Rufus Isaacs, K.C., on the modern stage, modern or Shakespearean exemplars, Charles Wyndham, high comedian, Osmond Turrell, died 1901, exponent of Shakespeare. Did the host encourage his guest to chant in a modulated voice of strange legend on the allied theme? Reassuredly, their place where none could hear them talk being secluded, reassured the decocted beverages, allowing for a sub-solid residual sediment of mechanical mixture, water plus sugar plus cream plus cocoa, having been consumed. Recite the first major part of this chanted legend. Little Harry Hughes and his schoolfellows all were out for to play ball. And the very first ball little Harry Hughes play, he drove it over the Jew's garden wall. And the very second ball little Harry Hughes played, he broke the Jew's windows all. How did the son of Rudolph receive this first part? With unmixed feeling. Smiling, a Jew, he heard with pleasure and saw the unbroken kitchen window. Recite the second part minor of the legend. Then out came the Jew's daughter, and she, all dressed in green, come back, you pretty little boy, and play your ball again. I can't come back, and I won't come back without my schoolfellows all, for if my master he did hear, he'd make it a sorry ball. And she took him by the lily-white hand, and led him along the hall, until she led him to a room where none could hear him call. She took a penknife out of her pocket, and cut off his little head, and now he'll play his ball no more, for he lies among the dead. How did the father of Millicent receive this second part? With mixed feelings. Unsmiling, he heard and saw with wonder a Jew's daughter all dressed in green.
Condense Stephen's commentary. One of all, the least of all, is the victim predestined. Once by inadvertence, twice by design, he challenges his destiny. It comes when he is abandoned and challenges him reluctant, and as an apparition of hope and youth, holds him unresisting. It leads him to a strange habitation, to a secret infidel apartment, and there implacable immolates him consenting. Why was the host, victim predestined, sad? He wished that a tale of a deed should be told of a deed, not by him, should by him not be told. Why was the host reluctant, unresisting? In accordance with the law of the conservation of energy. Why was the host, secret infidel, silent? He weighed the possible evidences for and against ritual murder. The incitation of the hierarchy, the superstition of the populace, the propagation of rumor in continued fraction of veridicity, the envy of opulence, the influence of retaliation, the sporadic reappearance of atavistic delinquency, the mitigating circumstances of fanaticism, hypnotic suggestion, and somnambulism. From which, if any, of these mental or physical disorders was he not totally immune? From hypnotic suggestion. Once, waking, he had not recognized his sleeping apartment. More than once, waking, he had been for an indefinite time incapable of moving or uttering sounds. From somnambulism. Once, sleeping, his body had risen, crouched, and crawled in the direction of a heatless fire, and having attained its destination, there, curled, unheated, in night attire, had lain sleeping. Had this latter or any cognate phenomenon declared itself in any member of his family? Twice. In Holles Street and in Ontario Terrace, his daughter Millicent, Millie, at the ages of 6 and 8 years, had uttered in sleep an exclamation of terror and had replied to the interrogations of 2 figures in night attire with a vacant, mute expression. What other infantile memories had he of her? 15th of June, 1889. A querulous newborn female infant crying to cause and lessen congestion. A child, renamed Padney Socks, she shook with shocks her money box, counted his 3 free many penny buttons, 1, 2, 3. A doll, a boy, a sailor, she cast away. Blonde, born of 2 dark. She had blonde ancestry, remote, a violation. Herr Hauptmann Haunau, Austrian Army, proximate, a hallucination. Lieutenant Mulvey, British Navy. What endemic characteristics were present? Conversely, the nasal and frontal formation was derived in a direct line of lineage, which, though uninterrupted, would continue at distant intervals to more distant intervals, to its most distant intervals. What memories had he of her adolescence? She relegated her hoop and skipping rope to a recess. On the Duke's lawn, entreated by an English visitor, she declined to permit him to make and take away her photographic image. Objection not stated. On the South Circular Road, in the company of Elsa Porter, followed by an individual of sinister aspect, she went halfway down Stamer Street and turned abruptly back. Reason of change? Not stated. On the vigil of the 15th anniversary of her birth, she wrote a letter from Mullingar, County Westmeath, making a brief allusion to a local student. Faculty and year not stated. Did that first division, portending a second division, afflict him? Less than he had imagined, more than he had hoped. What second departure was contemporaneously perceived by him, similarly, if differently? A temporary departure of his cat. Why similarly? Why differently? Similarly, because actuated by a secret purpose, the quest of a new male, Mullingar student, or of a healing herb, valerian. Differently, because of different possible returns to the inhabitants or to the habitation. In other respects, were there differences similar? In passivity, in economy, in the instinct of tradition, in unexpectedness. As? Inasmuch as leaning, she sustained her blonde hair for him to ribbon it for her. Neck-arching cat. Moreover, on the free surface of the lake in Stephen's Green, amid inverted reflections of trees, her uncommented spit, describing concentric circles of waterings, indicated by the constancy of its permanence, the locus of a somnolent prostate fish, mouse-watching cat. Again, in order to remember the date, combatants, issue, and consequences of a famous military engagement, she pulled a plait of her hair, ear-washing cat. Furthermore, silly Millie, she dreamed of having had an unspoken, unremembered conversation with a horse, whose name had been Joseph, to which she had offered a tumblerful of lemonade, which he, had appeared to have accepted. Hearth-dreaming cat. Hence, in passivity, in economy, in the instinct of tradition, in unexpectedness, where differences were similar. In what way had he utilized gifts? 1. An owl. 2. A clock, given as matrimonial auguries to interest and to instruct her. As object lessons to explain. 1. The nature and habits of oviparous animals, the possibility of aerial flight, certain abnormalities of vision, the secular process of embalsamation. 2. The principle of the pendulum, exemplified in bob, wheel gear, and regulator, the translation in terms of human or social regulation of the various positions of clockwise movable indicators on an unmoving dial, the exactitude of the recurrence per hour of an instant in each hour, when the longer and the shorter indicator were at the same angle of inclination. Videlicet 5:11 minutes past each hour per hour in arithmetical progression. In what manners did she reciprocate? She remembered. On the 27th anniversary of his birth, she presented to him a breakfast moustache cup of imitation Crown Derby porcelain ware. She provided, at quarter day or thereabouts, if or when purchases had been made by him, not for her, she showed herself attentive to his necessities, anticipating his desires. She admired, a natural phenomenon having been explained by him, not for her, she expressed the immediate desire to possess without gradual acquisition a fraction of his science, the moiety, the quarter, 1,000th part. What proposal did Bloom, deambulist, father of Millie, somnambulist, make to Stephen, noctambulist? To pass and repose the hours intervening between Thursday proper and Friday normal, on an extemporized cubicle in the apartment immediately above the kitchen and immediately adjacent to the sleeping apartment of his host and hostess. What various advantages would or might have resulted from a prolongation of such an extemporization? For the guest, security of domicile and seclusion of study. For the host, rejuvenation of intelligence, vicarious satisfaction. For the hostess, disintegration of obsession, acquisition of correct Italian pronunciation. Why might these several provisional contingencies between a guest and a hostess not necessarily preclude or be precluded by a permanent eventuality of reconciliatory union between a schoolfellow and a Jew's daughter? Because the way to daughter led through mother, the way to mother through daughter. To what inconsequent polysyllabic question of his host did the guest return a monosyllabic negative answer? If he had known the late Mrs. Emily Sinico, accidentally killed at Sydney Parade Railway Station, 14th of October, 1903.
What inchoate corollary statement was consequently suppressed by the host? A statement explanatory of his absence on the occasion of the interment of Mrs. Mary Golding, 26 June 1903, vigil of the anniversary of the decease of Rudolph Bloom, born Virag. Was the proposal of asylum accepted? Promptly, inexplicably, with amicability, gratefully it was declined. What exchange of money took place between host and guest? The former returned to the latter, without interest, a sum of money, £1 7 advanced by the latter to the former. What counter-proposals were alternately advanced, accepted, modified, declined, restated in other terms, reaccepted, ratified, and reconfirmed? To inaugurate a prearranged course of Italian instruction, place the residence of the instructed. To inaugurate a course of vocal instruction, place the residence of the instructress. to inaugurate a series of static, semi-static, and peripatetic intellectual dialogues, places the residence of both speakers, if both speakers were resident in the same place, the Ship Hotel and Tavern, 6 Lower Abbey Street, W&E Connery Proprietors, the National Library of Ireland, 10 Kildare Street, the National Maternity Hospital, 29, 30, and 31 Hollis Street, a public garden, the vicinity of a place of worship, a conjunction of 2 or more public thoroughfares, the point of bisection of a right line drawn between their residences, if both speakers were resident in different places. What rendered problematic for Bloom the realizations of these mutually self-excluding propositions? The irreparability of the past. Once at a performance of Albert Hengler's circus in the Rotunda, Rutland Square, Dublin, an intuitive party-colored clown in quest of paternity had penetrated from the ring to a place in the auditorium where Bloom, solitary, was seated, and had publicly declared to an exhilarated audience that he, Bloom, was his, the clown's, papa. The imprevedibility of the future. Once, in the summer of 1898, he, Bloom, had marked a florin with 3 notches on the milled edge and tendered it in payment of an account to and received by J&T Davy Family Grocers, 1 Charlemont Mall, Grand Canal, for circulation on the waters of civic finance, for possible circuitous or direct return. Was the clown Bloom's son? No. Had Bloom's coin returned? Never. Why would a recurrent frustration the more depress him? Because at the critical turning point of human existence, he desired to amend many social conditions, the product of inequality and avarice and international animosity. He believed then that human life was infinitely perfectible, eliminating these conditions. There remained the generic conditions imposed by natural as distinct from human law, as integral parts of the human whole, the necessity of destruction to procure alimentary sustenance, the painful character of the ultimate functions of separate existence, the agonies of birth and death, the monotonous menstruation of simian and, particularly, human females, extending from the age of puberty to the menopause, inevitable accidents at sea, in mines and factories, certain very painful maladies and the resultant surgical operations, innate lunacy and congenital criminality, decimating epidemics, catastrophic cataclysms which make terror the basis of human mentality, seismic upheavals, the epicenters of which are located in densely populated regions, the fact of vital growth through convulsions of metamorphosis from infancy through maturity to decay. Why did he desist from speculation? Because it was a task for a superior intelligence to substitute other more acceptable phenomena in the place of the less acceptable phenomena to be removed. Did Stephen participate in his dejection? He affirmed his significance as a conscious, rational animal proceeding syllogistically from the known to the unknown, and a conscious, rational regent between a micro and a macrocosm ineluctably constructed upon the incertitude of the void. Was this affirmation apprehended by Bloom? Not verbally, substantially. What comforted his misapprehension? That as a competent, keyless citizen, he had proceeded energetically from the unknown to the known, through the incertitude of the void. In what order of precedence, with what attendant ceremony was the exodus from the house of bondage to the wilderness of inhabitation effected? Lighted candle in stick, borne by Bloom. Diaconal hat on ash plant, borne by Stephen. With what intonation secreto of what commemorative psalm? The 113th. Modus peregrinus in exitu Israel de Egypto domus Jacob del populo barbaro. What did each sow at the door of egress? Bloom set the candlestick on the floor. Stephen put the hat on his head. For what creature was the door of egress a door of ingress? For a cat. What spectacle confronted them when they, first the host then the guest, emerged silently, doubly dark from obscurity, by a passage from the rear of the house into the penumbra of the garden? heaven tree of stars hung with humid night blue fruit. With what meditations did Bloom accompany his demonstration to his companion of various constellation? Meditations of evolution increasingly vaster, of the moon invisible in incipient lunation, approaching perigee, of the infinite litigiousness scintillatingly uncondensed Milky Way, discernible by daylight by an observer placed at the lower end of a cylindrical vertical shaft 5,000 feet deep, sunk from the surface towards the center of the Earth, of Sirius, Alpha and Canis Major, 10 light years, 57 trillion miles distant, and in volume 900 times the dimension of our planet, of Arcturus, of the procession of equinoxes, of Orion with belt and sextuple sun Theta and nebula in which 100 of our solar systems could be contained, of moribund and of nascent new stars such as Nova in 1901, of our system plunging towards the constellation of Hercules, of the parallax and parallactic drift of so-called fixed stars, in reality ever moving from immeasurably remote eons to infinitely remote futures, in comparison with which the years 70 of allotted human life formed a parenthesis of infinitesimal brevity.
Were there obverse meditations of involution increasingly less vast? Of the eons of geological periods recorded in the stratifications of the Earth, of the myriad minute entomological organic existences concealed in cavities of the Earth, beneath removable stones, in hives and mounds, of microbes, germs, bacteria, bacilli, spermatozoa, of the incalculable trillions of billions of millions of imperceptible molecules, contained by cohesion of molecular affinity in a single pinhead, of the universe of human serum constellated with red and white bodies, themselves universes of void space, constellated with other bodies, each in continuity, its universe of divisible component bodies, of which each was again divisible in divisions of redivisible component bodies, dividends and divisors ever diminishing without actual division, till, if the progress were carried far enough, naught nowhere was never reached. Why did he not elaborate these calculations to a more precise result? Because some years previously, in 1886, when occupied with the problem of the quadrature of the circle, he had learned of the existence of a number, computed to a relative degree of accuracy, to be of such magnitude and of so many places, for example, the 9th power of the 9th power of 9, that the result having been obtained, 33 closely printed volumes of 1,000 pages each, of innumerable quires and reams of India paper, would have to be requisitioned in order to contain the complete tale of its printed integers of units, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions, the nucleus of potentiality of being raised to the utmost kinetic elaboration of any power of any of its powers. Did he find the problem of the inhabitability of the planets and their satellites by a race given in species, and of the possible social and moral redemption of said race by a redeemer, easier of solution? Of a different order of difficulty, conscious that the human organism, normally capable of sustaining an atmospheric pressure of 19 tons, when elevated to a considerable altitude in the terrestrial atmosphere, suffered with arithmetical progression of intensity, according to the line of demarcation between troposphere and stratosphere was approximated. From nasal hemorrhage, impeded respiration and vertigo, when proposing this problem for solution, he had conjectured as a working hypothesis, which could not be proved impossible, that a more adaptable and differently anatomically constructed race of beings might subsist otherwise under Martian, Mercurial, Veneral, Jovian, Saturnian, Neptunian or Uranian sufficient and equivalent conditions, though an Apogean humanity of beings created in varying forms, with finite differences, resulting similar to the whole to one another, would probably there as here remain inalterably and inalienably attached to vanities of vanities, and to all that is vanity. And the problem of possible redemption? The minor was proved by the major. Which various features of the constellations were in turn considered? The various colors of significant degrees of vitality: white, yellow, crimson, vermilion, cinnabar, their degrees of brilliancy, their magnitudes revealed up to and including the seventh, their positions, the Wagoner's star, the Walsingham Way, the Chariot of David, the annular cinctures of Saturn, the condensation of spiral nebulae into suns, the interdependent gyrations of double suns, the independent synchronous discoveries of Galileo, Simon Marius, Piazzi, Leverrier, Herschel, Gaillet, the systematizations attempted by Bode and Kepler of cubes of distances and squares of times of revolution, the almost infinite compressibility of hirsute comets and their vast elliptical egressive and reentrant orbits from perihelion to aphelion, the sidereal origin of meteoric stones, the Libyan floods on Mars about the period of the birth of the younger Satroscopist, the annual recurrence of meteoric showers about the period of the Feast of St. Lawrence, Martyr, 10th of August, the monthly recurrence known as the new moon, with the old moon in her arms, the posited influence of celestial on human bodies, the appearance of a star, first magnitude, of exceedingly brilliancy, dominating by night and day a new luminous sun generated by the collision and amalgamation in incandescence of two non-luminous X-suns, about the period of the birth of William Shakespeare over Delta in the recumbent, never-setting constellation of Cassiopeia, and of a star, second magnitude, of similar origin but lesser brilliancy, which had appeared in and disappeared from the constellation of the Corona Septentrionalis about the period of the birth of Leopold Bloom, and of other stars of presumably similar origin, which had effectively or presumably appeared in and disappeared from the constellation of Andromeda about the period of the birth of Stephen Dedalus, and in and from the constellation of Auriga some years after the birth and death of Rudolph Bloom Jr., and in and from other constellations some years before or after the birth or death of other persons. The attendant phenomena of eclipses, solar and lunar, from immersion to immersion, abatement of wind, transit of shadow, taciturnity of winged creatures, emergence of nocturnal or crepuscular animals, persistence of infernal light, obscurity of terrestrial waters, pallor of human beings. His, Bloom's, logical conclusion, having weighed the matter and allowing for possible error, that it was not a heaven tree, not a heaven grot, not a heaven beast, not a heaven man, that it was a utopia, there being no known method from the known to the unknown, an infinity renderable equally finite by the supposititious probable apposition of one or more bodies equally of the same and of different magnitude. A mobility of illusory forms immobilized in space, remobilized in air, a past which possibly had ceased to exist as a present before its spectators had entered actual present existence. Was he more convinced of the aesthetic value of the spectacle? Indubitably, in consequence of the reiterated examples of poets in the delirium of the frenzy of attachment, or in the abasement of rejection invoking ardent sympathetic constellations, or the frigidity of the satellite of their planet. Did he then accept as an article of belief the theory of astrological influences upon sublunary disasters? It seemed to him as possible of proof as of confutation, and the nomenclature employed in its selenographical charts as attributable to verifiable intuition as to fallacious analogy. The lake of dreams, the sea of rains, the gulf of dews, the ocean of fecundity. What special affinities appear to him to exist between the moon and woman? Her antiquity in preceding and surviving successive Tellurian generations, her nocturnal predominance, her satellitic dependence, her luminary reflection, her constancy under all her phases, rising and setting by her appointed times, waxing and waning, the forced invariability of her aspect, her indeterminate response to inaffirmative interrogation, her potency over effluent and refluent waters, her power to enamor, to mortify, to invest with beauty, to render insane, to incite to and aid delinquency, the tranquil inscrutability of her visage, the terribility of her isolated, dominant, implacable, resplendent propinquity, her omens of tempests and of calm, the stimulation of her light, her motion and her presence, the admonition of her craters, her arid seas, her silence, her splendor when visible, her attraction when invisible. What visible luminous sign attracted Bloom's who attracted Stephen's gaze? In the second-story rear of his, Bloom's house, the light of a paraffin oil lamp with oblique shade projected on a screen of roller blind, supplied by Frank O'Hara, window blind, curtain pole, and revolving shutter manufacturer, 16 Ainger Street. How did he elucidate the mystery of an invisible person, his wife, Marion, Molly, Bloom? Denoted by a visible splendid sign, a lamp? With indirect and direct verbal allusions or affirmations, with subdued affection and admiration, with description, with impediment, with suggestion. Both then were silent, each contemplating the other in both mirrors of the reciprocal flesh of their his not this fellow faces. Were they indefinitely inactive? At Stephen's suggestion, at Bloom's instigation both, first Stephen, then Bloom, in penumbra urinated, their sides contiguous, their organs of micturition reciprocally rendered invisible by manual circumcomposition. Their gazes, first Bloom's, then Stephen's, elevated to the projected luminous and semi-luminous shadow.